Welcome to PwC's What's Next in Cyber podcast series. I'm Joe Nocera, PwC's Cyber and Privacy Innovation Institute leader, and I'll be your moderator for today's webcast. Joining us today are Matt Gorham, our senior fellow in the Institute and the former assistant director of the FBI Cyber Division, and Dr. Erica Borgard, senior director of U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. They will share their perspectives on the importance of building a public and private partnership and why C-suite executives should capitalize on the seriousness with which government is approaching this issue. Welcome, Matt and Erica.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Sure. Well, let's get started. Matt, maybe we'll start with you. I would love to get your perspective, given your background in the FBI, why this topic is so important now, particularly around the public and private sector coordination in preventing cyber attacks.
I think the bottom line is the threat is more sophisticated and larger than it's ever been. And I think the nature of that threat demands that private industry and government work together. If you think about our adversaries operating, be they a nation state engaged in counter-normative or disruptive, destabilizing behavior, or a criminal group operating from safe havens overseas, they transit global infrastructure. They conduct their operations here in the United States, where 90% of critical infrastructure is in the hands of the private sector. And the private sector has primary responsibility for defending it. What that means is government and private industry must come together, both to understand the threat and then to take action to deter and dissuade the behavior. If you think about the threat picture as a series of puzzle pieces, and the government puts some of the puzzle pieces on the table, and then private industry puts pieces on the table, you get a much better understanding of the threat picture. And that allows you to more effectively, more efficiently impose risk and consequence on those adversaries. And it's only by government coming together with the private industry and private industry coming together with government in a collaborative way that you can have the most significant impact on those actors.
Thanks, Matt. Erica, maybe go to you. I've been hearing a lot about the Cyberspace, the Solarium Commission. Can you tell us a little bit more about the commission and what the primary goals are?
Sure. So the Cyberspace Solarium Commission is a bipartisan commission that was created by Congress in the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, and it's co-chaired by Senator Angus King and Representative Mike Gallagher. The commission was initially comprised of 14 commissioners, Democrats and Republicans, from both houses of Congress, from the executive branch, and from the private sector. And the commission's purpose was to develop a comprehensive strategy as well as a set of policy recommendations to defend the nation against cyber attacks of significant consequences. And the part I love about the commission is that it draws its inspiration from President Eisenhower's Project Solarium, which Eisenhower convened in the early days of the Cold War to develop a strategy to address the challenge posed by the Soviet Union. And what Eisenhower did is he called on 3 different teams to present competing perspectives on how to grapple with the Soviet threat. And then through a competitive process, this ultimately gave rise to the Cold War grand strategy that we now know of as containment. Similarly, our commission was organized into 3 different task forces, and each of these task forces examined a different strategic approach to cyber threats. So Task Force 1, which I led, explored a strategy based on defend forward and active disruption of cyber threats. Task Force 2 focused on improving domestic defense and resilience. And Task Force 3 addressed international norms and engagement. And each task force spent months conducting research, outreach, engagement, and ultimately produced 3 unique different strategic visions and also a set of policy recommendations. And then we stress tested those different task force reports against external teams of subject matter experts. And finally, we convened a simulation to assess how the different approaches would fare against different types of scenarios. This whole process led to the commission's strategy of layered cyber deterrence and more than 80 different policy recommendations, which you can find in the final report that was released last March.
Awesome. Well, you just mentioned a topic that I had a question around, and that's layered cyber deterrence. Can you tell us a little bit more about what exactly that means?
Yeah, so layered cyber deterrence updates what we think of as traditional deterrence concepts for the 21st century. So again, during the Cold War, deterrence was largely based on the threat of military retaliation, often through the threat of punishment to prevent unwanted actions. But applying that same deterrence logic to cyberspace requires taking into account a number of sort of different factors that make this particular problem set unique, including unprecedented levels of interconnection and interdependence, the diversity of stakeholders involved, the dependence of the American economy on the secure and reliable functioning of digital infrastructure, and the reality that many incidents that take place in cyberspace that we may seek to prevent or reduce simply don't rise to a use of force threshold. And so, according to a layered cyber deterrence approach, the US should combine different instruments of national power in different proportions to address the full range of malicious behavior that the US confronts in cyberspace. At the lower end of the spectrum, that would include international norms promotion and non-military instruments of power. In sort of the middle of the spectrum, it includes improving cybersecurity defenses and public-private collaboration to make it more difficult for malicious actors to conduct attacks. And then at the highest end, it includes imposing costs, often through employing military capabilities. And no one layer of layered cyber deterrence is sufficient in itself to reduce the magnitude and frequency of adversary cyber campaigns, but the relative weight of any given instrument may vary depending on the specific nature of the threat. And I would also say there's sort of two important innovations in the concept of layered cyber deterrence. The first is the emphasis on deterrence by denial versus by punishment. And so this is the idea that the best leverage you can get against an adversary is through making it more difficult for them to conduct their campaigns by improving our own defenses, reducing our vulnerabilities, and increasing our resilience. And the second innovation is the role of the private sector. So typically, national security strategies don't include private actors as essential stakeholders. But as we all know, in cyberspace, private entities own and operate the infrastructure, and the private sector is also the victim of so much malicious cyber activity. And this means that the private sector has to be incorporated in a meaningful way in an area it's typically excluded from, which is national security strategy.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So let's turn a little bit to the Biden administration. It's been said that cybersecurity is a top priority for them. I guess the question to both Erica and then Matt would be, what can we expect from government in the next, say, 12 to 18 months? How can it support and perhaps even enable the private sector? So Erica, I don't know if you want to start.
Sure. So, I would say off the bat, I think the Biden administration has taken a number of important steps to elevate the role of cybersecurity at the executive branch level. And I think it should be commended for those efforts. Most notable among these is the elevation of cyber within the National Security Council through the creation of the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology position. And this gives a really critical and important voice for cyber issues within the NSC. I would also say that, I think we've seen that other individuals who have been nominated and confirmed to fill key roles throughout the interagency bring with them a significant background in cybersecurity. And so overall, this is a team that isn't starting from scratch in terms of expertise and familiarity with cyber issues. That said, looking ahead over the next 12 to 18 months, I would say that an important next step for the Biden administration is to nominate and for the Senate to confirm a national cyber director and to subsequently build the office of the national cyber director, which can include up to 75 people. The National Cyber Director is an entirely new entity that was recommended by the Cyberspace Delirium Commission and then created in law in the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act. And the commission recommended creating this position because it recognized there was no sort of one institutionalized coordination function for cyber across the federal government. And there was also no one locus for engaging with the private sector. And the National Cyber Director is meant to carry out both of these important functions and also be the president's principal cybersecurity advisor.
Yeah, I think, first and foremost, I think you'll continue to hear calls from government for private industry to work with government. I think we saw that recently with NSA Director General Nakasoni's congressional testimony. You heard it in 2020 from FBI Director Wray when he rolled out a new FBI cyber strategy with partnership at its core. You see manifestations of this idea of cyber as the ultimate team sport in places like the National Defense Cyber Alliance, the National Cyber Forensic Training Alliance. I think you'll continue to hear those calls to come together, much like I said before, to lay those puzzle pieces on the table and figure out how private industry and government can collaboratively approach the threat. In terms of administration, I would continue to to expect a centralized and robust response to incidents that occur. We've seen that most recently with a couple of large incidents. And I would expect Congress to look at things, stemming out of the Solarium Commission, but also in Congress writ large, things like national data breach legislation, administrative subpoena powers for the Secret Service and the FBI to speed the process of attribution. And so I think we're going to be approaching a time where we're going to have a lot of government action. And really that a government action coupled with private industry collaboration will be the key to whether we're successful or we fail at this.
So let's stay on that topic of private sector collaboration with the public sector. Where do you see, Matt, the most benefit, and why might the private sector be reluctant to really coordinate more closely with the public sector?
Sure. As I mentioned before, kind of pieces of information and intelligence, the more of those puzzle pieces we can put on the table, the better off we'll be, the better we'll understand it. And so one thing I saw in government again and again is when the private sector worked with the government was able to take some of those puzzle pieces provided by private industry, anonymize them, and then disseminate them out to the broader community, which would then allow other private industry partners to recognize things in their systems and then come back to government. And that kind of iterative goodness and wholesome behavior really made us all safer over time. I think when you think about our ability to do that before an incident, then I think that's the first and foremost the way that private industry benefits from working with government. Secondly, on those days, those really bad days after an incident occurs, that's not the time to form a relationship with government. Trying to figure out government's equities, the private industry's equity is very difficult in the middle of a crisis. And so forming that relationship before that occurs allows quicker and more effective incident response. And I think sometimes that's really is at the heart of why there's a reticence to work with government. And I think that comes down to not understanding and not having that relationship. And so I think there's a reluctance because the thought is, if I call government, there'll be a number of agents responding to my company in raid jackets and causing much commotion. Well, that's not the way the FBI or the Secret Service responds to cyber incidents. And I think that, part of that lack of understanding of government also goes to, well, I'm not sure I want government coming in and looking at all my data. But that's, again, not the way the Secret Service, the FBI would respond to a cyber incident. They don't want to look at all of your data any more than you want them looking at your data. What government, in this case, and law enforcement or national security personnel are interested in are those artifacts of intrusion. And so there are very nuanced ways to do that in terms of response that allow you to keep your data and really only provide that information that is relevant or particularly those artifacts of an intrusion. So there are ways to work together, and at the core of that is forming that relationship so you understand the culture and equities and process before an incident occurs.
Erica, anything to add?
Yeah, so I, agree with what Matt said. I would also add that I think there's some reluctance on the part of the private sector in working more closely with the government because there are also questions about sort of what the value of this kind of partnership might be. And, if businesses are going to invest resources in deeper partnerships with the government, then there has to be a clear return on investment. I would also say that I think there are challenges posed by different objectives and viewpoints. Many companies have an international presence. They have to take into account the global implications of working with any particular government, and they may assess risk differently as a result. I would also say that companies have legitimate concerns that existing liability protections may not be sufficient to remove concerns about the risk of sharing some types of information with the government. That said, I think there's been a growing recognition on both sides that more public-private collaboration will be essential for addressing shared threats in cyberspace. And that's because the reality is that these threat actors are targeting across multiple verticals in the public and private sectors. And if we really want to get ahead of these threat actors, we need to treat them as sort of dynamic organizations that we can understand holistically. And to do that, the private sector and the government need to develop a shared picture of the threat environment. I would also add that on the government side, I think the government needs to improve the speed and usefulness and distribution of information that defenders in the private sector can actually use to improve their security. And so, this extends beyond sharing tactical information like indicators of compromise and other technical artifacts to block current threats. I think it should also enable strategic warning of emerging trends and technologies and threat vectors that can help drive investments in security controls.
So Erica, maybe you could talk a little bit about additional implications for the private sector. I know the report is mostly focused on what government can do, but one of the concepts that's in there is the definition of systematically important critical infrastructure, and what are the implications for companies that might be in that classification?
Yeah, so I would say that one of the Solarium Commission's more important recommendations that address public-private collaboration is updating what's called the Section 9 designation that President Obama defined in Executive Order 13636. And that sort of initial designation defines the critical infrastructure that is essential for our national security and our economic security. So what the Commission recommends is implementing a risk-based, transparent, and sustainable process for identifying the key systems and assets that underpin our economy and national security. And we call this systemically important critical infrastructure. And the Commission recommends codifying this designation in law. And the logic is that those entities that are responsible for systemically important critical infrastructure should be given both special assistance from the government and should also have additional security requirements given their unique importance. And I think that this is an area that should be closely followed by industry, because the private sector should help shape how this designation is ultimately defined and what its implications are, both in terms of the benefits that systemically important critical infrastructure owners and operators might receive from the federal government, as well as the additional burdens that would come with such a designation.
Okay. Maybe staying with Erica, there's been a lot of discussion and maybe some misunderstanding around the notion of defending forward. And I was hoping that maybe you could talk a little bit about that and maybe expand on any unexpected consequences or escalation that could occur from that notion.
Yeah, so this is certainly a question that's close to my heart because I worked on sort of the Defend Forward concept as part of Task Force 1 on the Commission. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And so the concept of Defend Forward was introduced in the 2018 Department of Defense Cyber Strategy. The strategy itself is classified, but there was a public summary of it that was released in 2018. And, the basic logic of Defend Forward is grounded in the idea that the military needed to shift from a more defensive and reactive posture focused on defending the Department of Defense's own networks and preparing to respond in the event of a cyber attack, to one that's a bit more proactive on a routine basis to address malicious behavior. And this would mean allowing cyber forces to maneuver in networks controlled by U.S. adversaries and third parties to learn about evolving adversary capabilities and TTPs and sharing that information with other stakeholders. It would also mean, and this is an area that's gotten, I think, more attention than the first implication of Defend Forward, it would mean conducting counter-cyber operations when authorized to disrupt, deny, or degrade adversary offensive capabilities and infrastructure. And so, given that this is a more proactive, or you could say assertive posture than in the past, a lot of observers have raised concerns about whether Defend Forward might pose escalatory risks, and in particular, whether it might result in retaliation against the private sector. I would say at this point, there's no conclusive evidence that these concerns have played out, but the concept is still new, and I think it will take time to ascertain whether Defend Forward poses increased risks or not. In the meantime, I think it's important for policymakers to define metrics for success of this strategy, to take into account potential risks and unintended consequences as campaigns are being implemented. And I also think that the implementation of Defend Forward should be consistent with the sector-specific norms that the United States is seeking to promote internationally, such as norms against targeting critical infrastructure in the financial services sector during peacetime.
Okay. So Matt, you mentioned earlier that cyber is the ultimate team sport. As you think about the private sector and how they can be an effective member of that team, what are some steps they should be taking?
Yeah, I think, if you think about cyber as the ultimate team sport, the best teams aren't always those all-star teams. The best football games you've ever watched aren't an all-star. It's really those teams that function as teams, and that goes to the relationship, and that goes to the best teammates. And so if I'm in private industry right now, I'm asking myself, do I have relationships with the local FBI office, the local Secret Service office, the local CISA personnel? Make sure that those personnel are baked into your incident response plan. Make sure you're exercising that incident response plan and you know how to contact those folks. And you're not just contacting an office, but you're contacting individuals. And so I think that's for me, the thing that the first proactive step, because once you get to know and have those relationships, then the other pieces that we talked about, laying pieces of the puzzle on the table, being able to respond on that bad day, those things flow naturally from forming that initial relationship.
So Matt, we're kind of at the end of our time here. Maybe any final takeaways from you, and then we'll go to Erica.
I think, again, to me, it comes down to, if we're going to work together as teammates, then you need to have those relationships in place. So ensure you have the relationships with your local offices in your community. Ensure you belong to organizations that bring private industry and government together, like the Domestic Security Alliance Council, the National Defense Cyber Alliance, the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance. Look for those opportunities to form the relationships and work together with government. And I believe that you will, at that point in time, begin to see the advantage in working with the government. And when I was in government, I know there was hesitancy to call government the first time, but it was rare that we didn't get a call the second time based on the interactions of the first occasion.
And Erica, any final comments from you?
Yeah, so, I'd say, there are two important takeaways from my perspective. I think the first is that, despite recent significant breaches, there are reasons to be optimistic about the future. As I said, I think the Biden administration has made it clear that cybersecurity is a top priority, and there's also bipartisan support in Congress for tackling cyber challenges. I can't remember a cycle of confirmation hearings where cyber issues were at the forefront of so many directed questions. And to me, this reaffirms the seriousness with which the federal government is treating cyber issues. And the second takeaway is that, this presents an opportunity for the private sector to help inform and be part of the dialogue that's happening in Washington. And I think industry should seize this moment.
Awesome. Well, I'd like to thank both Matt and Erica. This has been a great discussion today. One of the great things about my job is I get to learn something new every day. And I thought, this was probably one of our best podcasts from that perspective. For those that are listening, please look out for another episode of What's Next in Cyber coming soon.
Copyright 2021 PwC. All rights reserved. PwC refers to the PwC network and/or one or more of its member firms, each of which is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This content is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.